Hello and welcome. This week we are going to discuss air pollution regulations and some control philosophies. So basically we'll be discussing uh, the theoretical framework of some of these regulations that are in place or uh, that can be uh, envisioned for controlling air pollution in ambient air. So the major objectives for this week are we want to describe some of the major air pollution control philosophies, and we will apply physical and chemical principles to estimate emission rates. We will also calculate control efficiency required by the new source performance standards, and we will be able to recognize different titles of the Clean Air Act amendments. So let's start with the air pollution control philosophies. Um, so let me just select the pointer here. So most air pollution control engineers, they work with permits. So if you talk to engineers, a lot of what they do is permitting, because all major facilities, they must have a permit in order to operate in the United States. Any facility that's emitting, is any kind of a emitter, they have to have a permit for that. And these permits are authorized by local agencies, by state agencies, or sometimes by federal authorities, and these are in a sense written as the uh, emissions of pollutant X from the main stack of factory Y shall not exceed Z pounds per hour. So it kind of quantifies that a certain pollutant from a certain stack would not exceed a certain emission rate. Um, so the regulations are based on a mixture of four philosophies shown below. The first is the emission standards philosophy, then the air quality standards philosophy, and I should say the first two are the most um, prominent ones that are used or that have examples in the current law. Emission taxes, there are some examples, not as much as the first and second, and fourth is largely it's a conceptual, theoretical uh, philosophy which doesn't have a lot of examples right now. Okay, the first one, the emission standard philosophy. So here uh, we are basically, this is looking at the smokestack, making laws about the maximum emissions for different classes, which will keep the pollution emission rate at lowest possibility, and each class is required to limit emissions. So when I talk of class, it means a class could be automobiles, could be cement plants, could be certain kind of a certain kind of a product that's being produced, and a certain class of those products, automobile industries, construction industry, and which have some kind of a commonality. So you can make laws about what can be the maximum emissions from tailpipes of, say, SUVs, or this, as I said, the cement concrete plants, um, and then what is the lowest possible emissions for each class. Okay, and so if we follow it, it follows that if this philosophy is followed rigorously, we will have the cleanest air possible, and therefore this philosophy is also called the cleanest possible air philosophy, because you're emitting the lowest possible that you can, and that will automatically get you the cleanest air possible. And emission standards are applied to regulate the emission of pollutants from the chimneys of industrial plants. For example, any visible emissions from chimneys of coal-burning furnaces, they are indicative of emissions of air pollutant particles. Regulations which limit these visible emissions are a form of an emission standard. So we will talk a little bit about that later. There is a you look at the opacity of the income in the plume that you see that's emanating from a smokestack, and with the opacity of that you can put some controls in there. uh, there's a regulation for that. So but that's a sort of an emission standard, and this was the basis of most of the air pollution activities in the industrial world from 1800s 1970. And even in the current air pollution law, there are two sections that are pure emission standards. One of them is the new source performance standards, the NSPS, which we will talk a little bit more later, and the NESHAP, or the National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants. So here we are controlling what's being emitted from the stack. So that's the main idea in the emission standard philosophy. Now let's pivot to the second one, the air quality standard philosophy. So here, uh, the air quality standard philosophy, here we are not controlling what's coming out of the stack. We are controlling the concentrations in the ambient air. So in the emission standard philosophy, we call that the cleanest possible air philosophy. The air quality standard philosophy is called the zero damage philosophy. So we determine by certain methodologies that what's the concentration in the ambient air that would not cause any damage. It's an idealized version. Usually, you can. It's not easy to say that there's no damage below a certain threshold. But suppose there is, and we keep all the concentrations below that level, then there is zero damage, and therefore this is called the zero damage philosophy. And in that, when you're having zero damage, there may still be, you could still probably emit a little bit more than the cleanest possible air mandates, but you're still having zero damage. Your goal is to keep the ambient concentration below a certain number. You're not worried about what's coming out of the smokestack. Directly speaking, you are, but then the way you look at it is the ambient air quality. Now, what is the relation between threshold values and the philosophy of the air quality standard philosophy? So this whole philosophy of air quality standard, this is based on the assumption that the true situation for most major air pollutants is the threshold value situation. So that means if you consider a dose response curve, in this plot the x-axis is the dose. Dose for us would be the concentration of air pollutant to which the public is exposed, and the y-axis is the response, which would be the air pollution damage to the public. And so the no threshold dose response would be like this first one here. This is no threshold, that is any concentrations, you see, any dose will cause some harm. So there is no threshold. You have to bring it down as much as possible. Any existence of that particular pollutant would cause damage. Now this one here is a threshold type dose response, meaning let's see, like below this concentration. So if you are below this dose, then the response is zero, meaning there is no impact, there's no damage. And a lot of, as we said, the assumption is that the major air pollutants, they follow this threshold type curve. So there is a certain value below which there is zero damage. And so we can set the standard around that value or at that value. And so if you're above that, we see damages. If you're below that, we do not see any damages. Of course, this figure is a very idealized figure. Sometimes they're not necessarily linear, these threshold curves. And yeah, so that's so to apply this philosophy, someone must be studying the dose response data and finding out the threshold values. And that's what the NACS is for, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So these are maximum allowable level of contamination. That's a threshold value. The EPA established such standards for 6 major pollutants, right? We talked about it in our previous discussions. The process of setting these standards calls for issuing documents called the air quality criteria. And for this reason, the pollutants on this list are called the criteria pollutants. So that's an interesting tidbit. And then the states, uh, so once you have that standard defined, that threshold defined, then the states, it's a job of the states to manage air quality to ensure that those standards set by NACS will not be exceeded ever anywhere. So that's the intent of this air quality standard philosophy. Now, what's the pros and cons of this? So the cost effectiveness is it's good, but it's not excellent because um, sometimes those of you who live in Fairbanks, you know that Fairbanks is non-attainment for PM 2.5, and the NACs, of course, are a manifestation of the air quality standard philosophy. And despite lots of expenses being, by the EPA and the state of Alaska and the DEC, we have not yet achieved concentrations below the standard yet. So it depends. So cost effectiveness is not necessarily excellent. Depends on its case by case basis. And sometimes, say it's if you have an area where there are not a lot of people living, in a borough, the population density is, very small, or there are no people in a neighborhood. Just saying, it's like a, you know, forested area and so forth. But by law, even in that area, you have to have the concentrations below those levels. So, and you cannot say, okay, here there's less population, so we could have less stringent regulation. No, the law calls for having meeting the standard at all places at all times. So, if in that case, the philosophy would require some control expenditures, for which one could argue the damage reduction benefits are rather small. And this is kind of a big one here, a big downside of this, you can say, that no one has found a way to write a simple set of regulations based on this philosophy. Okay, now you might say we have the NACs, they are regulations. Yes, they are regulations, but then it's it's a very complex thing because you're trying to, when in the previous philosophy, the emission philosophies, emission standard philosophy, you could say, okay, you have to emit less than certain mass per hour, or less than certain whatever concentration, or usually it's like mass per unit time. And so you can easily set that thing, but then you're setting that, um, okay, what's the concentration in ambient air, that it depends on lots of different factors. Who are the different sources that are emitting in that area? There are multiple sources. What's the meteorology? What's the boundary layer height, and a lot of different things. So that make it, that all of those different factors make it hard to kind of you know uh, basically enforce, and we'll come to that as well, this philosophy or air quality standards. And so EPS has written some simple set of regulations based on this philosophy. um, and the reason it says for this complexity is that we are attempting to control the concentration of pollutants in the ambient air. As I said, the concentration of pollutants in the ambient air is that's a, those concentrations are a result of multitudes of factors. There's not just one factor at play, and how those factors are playing out in a certain scenario, or even at a given time, or month, or season, or day, or time of day, it could vary. It's highly variable. So that introduces inherent complexity. And for this reason, the enforcement difficulty of this philosophy results from the same cause as its complexity, namely that one is trying to enforce air quality. You could easily enforce, or what's coming out of the stack. You could measure it and say that, hey, you are emitting more than you should be emitting. But then, if you're enforcing air quality, you want the ambient air to have concentration below a certain number. How do you know who's responsible for that? Is it because of the meteorology? Is it because of a certain emitter? Is it because of a certain other emitter? uh, and so you can't really like pinpoint very, very confidently, very clearly So it's hard to enforce, and it's playing out very, this whole thing in Fairbanks. And take the example of Fairbanks again, and we are non-attainment for PM 2.5, and some studies showed that initially people believed that it's the coal-fired power plant, that we have the Aurora energy plant, and that's to blame. But then certain studies showed that no, it's the residential wood burning that's a major contributor. But then how do you regulate residential emitters? Usually the law that's written, as you'll study, is not for residential emitters. And then it's, some people still believe that it's not the residential, it's the other emitters. So overall, it's a whole can of worms, and with the state and the borough are navigating that complex thing. So it's hard to enforce this, because you can't, you can't easily have a control handle on trying to achieve a certain level of air quality in the ambient air. The flexibility of this philosophy is fair, because there are multiple ways by which you could try to achieve that standard. You have multiple, uh, there are no one specific control handle, but there are multiple handles out there. So like Burrow is doing a lot of different, stove change out, burn bans. You could have fuel changes, and so many different ways that you could try to attempt to solve the issue. So it has a fair bit of flexibility in this philosophy. And the evolutionary ability, the air quality standards philosophy is also fair. Uh, they're revised every now and then. Uh, okay, and the most difficulty with this air quality standard philosophy, which has led to a lot of court action in the U.S., it stems from this question of non-degradation or non-deterioration. So which basically means, if it were absolutely true that there was no damage at all of any kind at concentrations below the threshold values, then there could be no logical objections to polluting up to those concentrations. So um, in effect, the EPA guidelines to the states for developing the standard implementation plans, the state implementation plan, the SIPs, they took that view. So a lot of states took that view that as long as you're below the threshold values, there's no harm, there is no problem, and you just need to be below the standard. But the standard, it's not black and white, that you're below the standard, you're all good, and you're just above the standard, and it's all bad. There's a gray area a lot of times. The threshold values are not, and they're collected from limited data, so you cannot be completely sure that below a certain value there wouldn't be any harm. So uh, especially things like visibility, it's not a threshold value property. And uh, if you could, if, if we were to pollute up to the standards, most of the, especially for, say, uh, the national parks and places like that, if you try to say, okay, we can pollute them up to the standard, then that would probably not be a good thing. So a lot of the scenic areas of the Southwest and the Rocky Mountain states, they would experience a marked uh, and significant degradation of the traditionally high visibility and clear skies. So, uh, a lot of environmental groups challenged the NACs for those cases in court. And finally, this led to this Prevention of Significant Deterioration uh, Act, or that was not the act, that was this is one of the titles of the Clean Air Act, but that was added, and we'll talk about it towards the end of this class. Emission tax philosophy. This talks about having a law based on emission, uh, that the more you emit, you have to pay a certain tax or a fine or a fee. So you are X cents per pound of pollutant Y for all emitters. So you have a tax rate. So this would be set so that most major polluters, they would find it more economical to install pollution control equipment than pay the taxes. So this you can make more an economic decision than just government uh, mandated limit. And sometimes these taxes have been proposed in combination with air quality standard philosophy. And in this combination, the emission taxes act as an added incentive to reduce emissions to lower levels, even than lower than those required to meet the standards, because now you're looking at it's an economic incentive to go lower than the standard. So the air quality standards and emission taxes, they would work in parallel. And it's a member, the emission tax philosophy, it's a member of a larger class of philosophies called economic incentives. So you could have tax rebates, you could have low interest rate loans from the government for the installation of air pollution control equipment. You could have direct subsidies, public subsidies for pollution control. Uh, in some ways, there have been subsidies on electric vehicles, and those are in some ways, loosely you could say they're part of this whole strategy of emission tax, although it's an incentive. And then the last one, the cost benefit philosophy. This assumes, here the assumption is, so remember the air quality standard philosophy, the assumption was there's a threshold. Here the assumption is that you're assuming there are no thresholds, or there are very low thresholds, and so they're so low that we can't afford to have that clean of an air. So we must accept some amount of air pollution, damage to someone somewhere. Now it's a question of how do we decide that? And the cost benefit philosophy suggests that we attempt to decide in as rational a manner as possible how much damage we should accept and how much we should be willing to spend to reduce damages. So this plot here would make it much more clear what this is about. So on the y-axis you have cost, on the x-axis you have ambient air concentration of pollutant. So there are there are two graphs here, actually, or there are three, but let me break it down for you. So this one here is the pollution damage cost. So obviously, as the ambient concentration increases, the uh, the damage from pollution increases, and as this is the pollution control cost or pollution control expenditure. So if you have to keep the concentration very low, the control cost would be very high, and if you keep the concentration very high, the the basically not spending anything on controlling the uh, pollution or pollution control. So, and now if you add the two, one is the damage cost, one is the control cost. So you get this U-shaped curve. And now if you have to minimize the total cost, then somewhere here in the middle, that, okay, here you have a relatively, optimum ambient air concentration where the damage is relatively low and the control costs are relatively low as well. So that's the cost benefit philosophy. Try to figure out that optimum and operate within that range. So, and this conceptual diagram is for one pollutant at one location. But if you were to actually implement a philosophy like this, there would be multiple, plots like this, and then you would have to, for different locations maybe, and how that would all play out. That would make it pretty complex to implement it. But it's a framework that could be, that it's perspective, another perspective on air pollution control. And here's a table that compares, how these different for the emission standard, air quality standard, emission taxes, and cost benefit analysis, how their cost effectiveness. Now, just if you look at the cost effectiveness of the cost benefit analysis, this is excellent because we are minimizing the costs. And then, but it's, as I said, it's not simple. So it's pretty complex. So the simplicity is not good. It's terrible. How you would enforce it? Is it flexibility? That's, as I said, there are no existing examples pretty much, so that's kind of unknown. But then you could potentially modify it based on the information that you have. And then we've already discussed some of the characteristics of some of the other ones. So we talked a little bit about the new source performance standards, and here's a table which I also added as a handout in the course web page, or the Canvas course modules. And so these are this table 2.3, this shows the new source performance standards for fossil fuel electric utility steam generating units, or for the coal-fired power plants. And there are different standards for different kind of industries and so forth. This table is part of the textbook as well. So there's the SO2 standard. It's an example of, we're taking one example here of industry. We are doing the power plants, the coal-fired power plants, but there are the regulations. They define these things for a lot of different industries. There's the particulate standard. So let's consider the SO2 standard. It says for a coal-fired unit, the standard requires at least 90% reduction of a potential SO2 emissions and limits the emission to this rate. Okay, so this whole information is tabulated here nicely. It says uncontrolled emission rate, meaning if you have no control technology installed, or your how much you're emitting without any controls, that's called the UER. So if your UER, or your uncontrolled emission rate, is less than 2 pounds of sulfur dioxide per million BTUs of coal, then you need 70% efficiency. So you need to compute that, okay, you can emit only 30% of that, you need to remove 70%. If your range is between 2 to 6 pounds, then you can emit, so here it's given in a percentage. For this range, it's given as the amount. You can only emit up to 0.6 pounds per million BTUs. And you would use the formula here. And then if you're in 6 to 12 range, you have to remove 90%, and so forth. So we will do example problems based on some of these. So I just wanted to introduce them here. Similarly, there are particulate standards where emissions are limited to 0.03 pounds per million BTUs of heat input. And there are NOx standards and so forth. And then the part of this is also the emission factors for bituminous and subbituminous coal. So here, for example, for sulfur dioxides, say if you're taking this is a firing configuration, or the number is similar for all these firing configurations. The emission factor means that how much sulfur dioxide is being emitted. It's a function of the sulfur content in the coal. So it's 19.5 S, and so 19.5 S kilogram per megagram of coal going in, or sometimes it's per ton. And here for particulates, it's again a matter of the ash content of the coal, how much ash is in the coal. So this can tell you what your the uncontrolled emission rates are. This can inform, and then you can see how much efficiency you need, and so forth. So we were talking about, as I said, there's the EPA method 9, which talks about opacity. So if you have this smokestack here, you can see this is 20%. This is defined as 20% is legal. Then as the concentrations increase, it's 40%, 80%. Although it seems that you might how do you decide, or how do you measure it very scientifically? There are actually ways to do that, and there is a method 9 by the EPA. If you want to learn more, you could go to this link and see how that's implemented. There's actually training. People are trained to measure those things over and over and over. There is the bituminous coal, the anthracite coal, and different kinds of coal. which have different ash content, sulfur content, which would lead to different emissions and different requirements for pollution control technologies to abide with the NSPS. Okay, let's do some examples.
Okay, let's consider, before we do the examples, let's consider the NSPS a little bit, the New Source Performance Standards. These are national rules for emissions. So this is emission based, as we just discussed, and it applies to industries such as power plants, cement manufacturing, incinerators, chemical plants, metal refineries, etc. So within that, let's consider the power plant standards as an example. So if you look at the power plant standards, so this was, the initial standards in the NSPS. They were applicable to plants that were greater than 73 megawatts and were built after 1978. And so if you look at, and then it defined standards for mainly 3 pollutants. It directed control of sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, and nitrogen oxides, NOx. So the SO2 standard for SO, we'll just look at the table in a moment here. Let's see. There's this table here. So you can see this is the table 2.3, and these regulations applied to units of more than 73 megawatts of heat input, of which the construction began after September 1978, and it directed the control of sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, and NOx. And so for SO2 standard, for SO2, this is the table. So let's see. So first we have to calculate, whenever we do this, we have to calculate the uncontrolled emission rate, and then we will use this table. So to calculate the control efficiencies required. So before we look at this table, let's consider a power plant. Say we have a power plant and with an efficiency of 35%, meaning that it converts, say, if it has an input of 1,000,000 BTUs of coal, British thermal units BTUs of coal is what comes in, then 35% efficiency means that out of that 1,000,000 BTU going in, only 35% of that's 350,000 BTUs of electricity is generated. And say in this you have uncontrolled emissions of, so say there are 1 pound of uncontrolled emissions. So you put in a control technology, some control system, and when we put in the control, say the control efficiency is 90%. So that means 90% is getting removed and only 10%, in this case that would be 0.1 pounds, is being released to the atmosphere. So okay, now let's look at some of these different recommendations in this for sulfur dioxide. It says 90% reduction with the maximum of 1.2 pounds SO2 per million BTUs of heat input, that's energy in coal, or you have 70% reduction with a maximum of 0.6 pounds of SO2. So these are the uncontrolled emissions. So these in the parentheses these are the uncontrolled emissions, and then correspondingly we will calculate how much reduction is needed. So we'll do an example for these shortly. You'll get a better idea of this. And for particulate matter, this is from ash. The regulation said 0.03 pounds per million BTUs of heat input, and the opacity has to be less than 20%. So this is the maximum emission allowed. So let me say this one. So emissions have to be less than this, and opacity less than 20%. And we looked at that slide about opacity earlier. And the NOx emissions are limited to 0.6 pounds of NOx per million BTUs of heat input. And another thing that we will be looking at is the emission factors. So to calculate emissions, so the uncontrolled emission rate, we would need something called the emission factors. And for this, there's a document, AP42 has a compilation. of all emission factors. And this is given in table 2.5. And so, for example, so let's look at table 2.5. Here's the table 2.5. And so we will look at, say, example of this example right here for sulfur dioxide. And this is the units of pounds per ton. And it's 39S, it says. So I'll recommend you may want to read the footnotes and get a better idea of this table. But from this table, emission factor is, if you're looking at, say, coal, as I was just saying, it's 39S pounds per ton for SO2 from pulverized coal-fired boilers. Where S is the sulfur weight percentage in coal. And another thing that we are going to be using in the problems is the heating value. So heating value is this is from your thermodynamics, or it's the energy content of fuel, basically. And usually that's in terms of BTUs, how much BTUs per pound, or kilojoules per kilogram, and so forth. Okay, so we will be using these two tables, table 2.3 and table 2.5, to solve our problems. Let's look at example 1. So in this, we have a newly constructed power plant which proposes to burn coal with a heating value. So let's write down the information given to us. The heating value is 10,500 BTUs per pound. And the percent sulfur by weight, so S is equal to 1.2. We have to find the efficiency required to meet the NSPS. So let's see. We have our emission factor from table 2.5 we just saw in pounds per ton is 39S. 39 times 1.2, which would be equal to 46.8 pounds of SO2 per ton of coal. Now, the uncontrolled emission rate, UER, we need that. Because see, finally we need to look at this table. And this table, we need to find the UER to see what control efficiency is needed for us. So the uncontrolled emission rate, UER, is equal to the emission factor divided by the heating value. And so the emission factor tells us it's 46.8 pounds per ton divided by 10,500 BTUs per pound. And let's convert tons to pound as well. A ton has 2,000 pounds. So this gives us 2.2 into 10 to power minus 6 pounds of SO2 per BTU of coal, or we can say 2.2 pounds of SO2 per million BTUs, because that's the way the table is, the units are, you see the pounds of SO2 is SO2 per million BTUs. So we have 2.2. So for 2.2 is actually right here in this range. So for this range, we can have the maximum allowable emission rate based on table 2.3. So maximum allowable emission rate would be equal to 0.6 pounds of SO2 per million BTUs. So the efficiency needed would be, so we have 2.2, we can only emit 0.6, so we have to remove this much and divide by 2.2, that is 0.74. So we need 74% removal efficiency. So that's the control efficiency needed. That's the answer. Okay. Let's now look at next example. Example 2. So this says, according to the EPA's EP42 compilation of emission factors, the factor for SO2 from coal is 39 S pounds per ton, which we just saw, where S is the sulfur content of the coal in percent. So from basic principles, independently estimate the SO2 emission factor for coal containing 2% sulfur, and then compare your result to the AP42 value. And we're assuming all sulfur in coal is converted to SO2 during combustion. So let's first do from basic principles. So we are trying to find the emission factor in the units of pounds of SO2 per ton of coal. Right, that's what our target is. Now we know that 1 mole of sulfur in coal, let me write it here. So we know that 1 mole of sulfur in coal will produce 1 mole of SO2. And we are given 2% sulfur in coal. So the emission factor is going to be, if it's 2% sulfur in coal, that would be 0.02 grams of S for a gram of coal. And 1 mole of sulfur, I'm trying to get this in moles, is 32 grams. We know that. And then we also know that 1 mole of SO, like from 1 mole of sulfur, we get 1 mole of SO2. And a mole of SO2 would produce 64 grams of, or a mole of SO2 is, molecular weight for that is 64 grams. So let's, this cancel out, grams of sulfur, cancels out here. Actually, this should be grams of sulfur, right? So cancel out the grams of sulfur, mole of S with mole of S, mole of SO2 with mole of SO2. And since we need in tons, so let's just calculate this for now. If we calculate this, we get 0.04, because basically 32 times 2 is 64, so that's 0.04 grams of SO2 per gram of coal, right? And so that will also mean 0.04 pounds of SO2 per pound of coal. And we know that 2000 pounds is a ton. So if we calculate that, what we get is 80 pounds of SO2 per ton of coal. So this is the emission factor in the units we needed based on basic principles. And now let's just and if you look at the AP42, so it's pretty straightforward. Here in AP42, emission factor is 39S, which is 39 times 2, which would be 78 pounds of SO2 per ton of coal. So you can see they're pretty, pretty close. They're pretty similar. Okay, let's consider example 3. So I'll let you read the question. So we have to find there are 2 parts to this problem. So first part is estimate the level of SO2 control that would be needed, and then for such and such power plant, and then what is the resulting emission rate of SO2 in kilograms per hour. So let's do the first part first. So we will find, so it's similar, the first part is similar to what we have done in the previous problems. It's our problem 1 actually. So we find the uncontrolled emission rate in the units of pounds per million BTUs, right? And then we know the formula, right? That UER is equal to heating value divided by the emission factor divided by the heating value. And so in this case, this would be equal to the emission factor it's again it's 2%, so we just saw that, so I can just write 0.04 pounds per pound, and pounds of SO2 per pound of coal divided by 13,600 BTUs per pound, and this would be equal to 2.9 into 10 to the power minus 6 pounds per BTU, or 2.9 pounds of SO2 divided by million BTUs. So that's our uncontrolled emission rate. So now let's look at this table. Go back to the table here. Oops, that's our table here, and this is again falling in this category. So we would need again this right here, that's the required maximum allowable emission rate of 0.6 pounds. So sorry for all the scrolling. So max allowable emission rate would be equal to 0.6 pounds of SO2 per million BTUs. Now, this is based on table 2.3. From table 2.3, and we have to find the control needed. So the 2.9 minus 0.6 divided by 2.9 times 100%, so this would be 79% control efficiency needed. So that's part A. Now let's do part B. What is the resulting emission rate of SO2 in kilograms per hour? So let's draw a quick schematic of, so the power plant here is 35% efficient, and it's a 600 megawatt plant, and then we have some uncontrolled emissions, and we are removing 79% of those are removed, and finally we are emitting 0.6 pounds SO2 per million BTUs of heat input. But now we have to convert this into a kilogram of, let's see, it says kilogram per hour. Okay. So the first step here would be, we would calculate the heat input, or the, because it's based on heat input. So say the heat input here is H is the heat input, so H times the efficiency, and the efficiency here is 35%, is 600 megawatt. So that implies that, so that implies 600 divided by 1714 megawatts. So this is, and so now let's see, so now we should note just a unit conversion here, that 1 watt is 3.41 BTUs per hour. So that implies 1 megawatt is 3.41 times 10 to the power 6 BTUs per hour. Okay, so now we have to calculate the emission rate in kilogram per hour, right? So that would be, so we know we can emit a maximum of 0.6 pounds of SO2 for a million BTUs of heat input. Now what is the heat input we have? We have 1714 megawatt, and as I just said, 1 megawatt is 3.41 times 10 to the power 6 BTUs per hour. And to convert to kilogram, we can also write, 0.454 kilograms is a pound. So now let's cancel all the units. That can be cancelled. BTUs cancelled with BTUs, megawatts with megawatt, pounds with pound. So what we have is kilogram per hour, the units that we wanted. So this is 0.6 times 1714 times 3.41 into 10 to the power 6 times 0.454 divided by 10 to the power 6 kilograms per hour. And of course these two cancel out. And if you solve this, it's approximately 1600 kilograms of SO2 per hour. So that's the answer for this.